Mastering Pac-Man was published in 1981. Ken Uston, known for gambling, counting cards, and suing to get around being banned from casinos, is the author of this book. This is a strategy guide for Pac-Man. It has to be one of the earliest examples of a strategy guide. What makes it even more interesting is that it's for an arcade game. It's about helping players get a better high score. What is very cool is that Ken included diagrams to help the reader better understand just what is being talked about. I thought this was a little odd at first, but then I remembered they couldn't just take a screenshot or something along those lines of the game. It was a lot harder to do back in the early 80s than it is now. This was written before the first perfect game of Pac-Man was performed, so not all of the information is going to be accurate, and Ken couldn't have known about some of the things that were going to be discovered. The first few chapters go over the basics of Pac-Man. Ken assumes that the reader has little to no knowledge of the game, which is a fair assumption. It wasn't just for kids. Everyone was pretty much playing Pac-Man as long as they went into an arcade or found it at one of the many places that arcade machines were. I should point out that this is exclusive to the arcade version. The home version and some of the clones weren't necessarily out yet, or Ken wasn't always aware of all of them. He does mention a few of the arcade clones, but he doesn't get into them too much. They kind of get lumped together at the end, along with the Coleco handheld arcade. There are tables that break down the point totals for the game, so how many points you can get from eating all the ghosts after you get the power pellet, how many points you get from the different pieces of fruit or items that Pac-Man can eat in the levels, and he also goes over the differences between a fast game and a slow game, and says these are kind of the difficulty settings. These were the settings that an arcade owner could put into the game before you actually got in there and started playing. It did make me wonder if there were other settings on the machines. After 40 years, someone probably has a breakdown of how these machines really work. Over the years, there's been a ton of research done on these different arcade games, so some of the arcade enthusiasts most likely have more information than what Ken was privy to at the time. The last part of this section pretty much guides the reader to whatever pattern is going to be best for them. This encourages the reader to kind of skip around in the book. If you considered yourself an expert, you would skip to the end of the book, but if you were a beginner, you just went right on to chapter 5, which would have been the next chapter in this, whole sequence that we're going through here. Ken says that there are 5 patterns to play Pac-Man in this book. He also gives a certain number of levels that each pattern is kind of optimized for. I think there might be more than 5 patterns, just because while I was reading this, it felt like I had stumbled across more while I was going through it. Maybe I was just seeing a variant if something, some variable was different, or if, you were playing on the slow mode versus the fast mode. That could have been what I was reading, but I'm not really sure. That was not as clear to me as some of the other stuff in this book. I do like this approach, though. However, it's kind of been rendered obsolete since, the book's from 1981, and there's been 40 years of people playing Pac-Man up to this point. It is important to remember that at the time, there was no internet, no video sharing service, and the closest thing to a Let's Play was being lucky enough to find a friendly expert in the arcades. Basically, you would have to learn this game by doing. You wouldn't be able to just, sit down and study it unless you just watched everybody play Pac-Man, which is a possibility, but I don't really think that would have happened. You also could have been fortunate enough to have bought this book, but I don't think this one sold as well as some of his poker books. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just don't think this was going to be as widespread as you would think. This is, similar to today, though. If you needed to find information on something. Like if you had a problem that you were stuck on and you didn't know where to find the solution, you probably would have just continued to be stuck on that problem, or you would have had to have worked it out yourself, or hope that somebody had done something to let you know what the answer to your problem was. Ken does include keys for the different patterns, so you kind of know what the heck he's talking about, what some of the symbols are. He does talk about them in the text, but if you just want to study the patterns, it is nice to have a key for them. Ken also explains that you might need to know several of these patterns in order to get higher scores. One pattern won't necessarily work on every board, as he kind of shows you when you look through it and you see this one is good for boards 3 through 11 and that sort of thing. It is important to point out that the game will slowly ramp up in difficulty, so knowing the different patterns would probably help out quite a bit. I mentioned that Ken goes over the clones, or at least some of the clones. The two that he mentions are Maze Man and New Puck 1. He also goes over the Pac-Man mini arcade that Coleco put out. This is kind of an odd addition to the book, and I don't think it's really all that necessary to include them in here. Even Ken mentions that these clones were not very widespread. He speculates that they were less than 1% of all the Pac-Man cabinets out there. He doesn't give us a figure, but I wouldn't really expect him to. This was 1981, and there would be more clones and copycats released. Ken couldn't possibly know about all of them, and a chapter like this is honestly more interesting from a historical perspective than it is from, being included in a strategy guide. He does include some breakdowns of the boards for Maze Man and New Puck 1, and talks about some of the differences between those boards and what Pac-Man had. The changes to the boards seem more like just an attempt to avoid copyright problems, just change a few things, add some more tunnels, and do a little bit to make it harder for somebody to say you made a direct copy while still basically making a direct copy. This last part is really kind of the fun part of the book. Ken gives the readers some tips that he's picked up along the way, and there is also some speculation about where arcade games will be going. There would be new versions of Pac-Man, and also games that have similar play patterns. Beating the game is brought up. Ken didn't know about the kill screen or a perfect game of Pac-Man from reading this. In 1981, I don't think anyone aside from the developers really knew about the kill screen or the maximum number of points that were possible. No one had really beaten it at this point, or at least in 1981 as far as I know. I could be a little wrong on that, but I think the first perfect Pac-Man game wasn't until like the mid-90s or something like that. Ken does seem pretty aware of just the change in technology, and he really encourages the reader to come up with new patterns. I'm guessing this would go for, like the future clones and the future ports and that sort of thing. He doesn't really mention anything like that because he probably couldn't have known about just all of the computer ports that were going to come, as well as the home console ports. It is still an interesting book just because it's a strategy guide from 1981 that isn't necessarily presented as a strategy guide. It's pretty awesome to go back and read something like this and just see how much strategy guides have really changed over the years. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.